The Doctor of Pimlico, being the disclosure of a great crime. Part 3, Chapter 21. The widened breach. When Sir Hugh entered his cozy study, he found the doctor seated at his ease in the big chair by the fire. I thought that, being in the vicinity, I would call and see if you've recovered from your silly fit of irritability, he said, with a grim smile on his grey face as he looked towards the general. I have just received bad news which I have all along dreaded, replied the unhappy man, the telegram still in his hand. Paul Le Pontois has been arrested on some mysterious charge. False, without a doubt. Yes, replied Wearmarsh. It is most unfortunate. I heard it an hour ago, and the real reason of my visit was to tell you of the contretemps. Someone must have made a false charge against him, cried the general excitedly. The poor fellow is innocent. Entirely innocent. I only have a brief telegram from his wife. She is in despair, and leaves for London tonight. My dear Sir Hugh, France is in a very hysterical mood just now. Of course, there must be some mistake. Some private enemy of his has made the charge without a doubt. Someone jealous of his position, perhaps. Allegations are easily made, though not so easily substantiated, except by manufactured evidence and forged documents, snapped Sir Hugh. If Paul is the victim of some political party and is to be made a scapegoat, then heaven help him, poor fellow. They will never allow him to prove his innocence, unless... Unless what? Unless I come forward, he said very slowly, staring straight before him. Unless I come forward and tell the truth of my dealings with you. The charges against Paul are false. I know it now. What have you to say? He added in a low, hard voice. A great deal of good that would do, laughed Wearmarsh, selecting a cigarette from his gold case and lighting it, regarding his host with those narrow-set, sinister eyes of his. It would only implicate Le Pontois further. They would say, and with truth, that you knew of the whole conspiracy and had profited by it. I should tell them what I know concerning you. Indeed, I wrote out a full statement while I was staying with Paul, and I have it ready to hand for the authorities. You can do so, of course, if you choose, was the careless reply. It really doesn't matter to me what statement you make. You have always preserved silence up to the present. Therefore I should believe that in this case silence was still golden. And you suggest that I stand calmly by and see Le Pontois sentenced to a long term of imprisonment for a crime which he has not committed. Eh? I don't suggest anything, my dear Sir Hugh, was the man's reply. I leave it all to your good judgment. Since they had met in secret, Wearmarsh had made a flying visit to Brussels, where he had conferred with two friends of his. Upon their suggestion he was now acting. If Paul Le Pontois was secretly denounced and afterwards found innocent, then it would only mystify the French police. The policy pursued towards the Schut, as well as towards Sir Hugh, was a clever move on Wearmarsh's part. What am I to say to my poor girl when she arrives here in tears tomorrow? Demanded the fine old British officer hoarsely. You know that best yourself, was Wearmarsh's brusque reply. To you I owe all my recent troubles, the elder man declared. Because, he added bitterly, you bought me up body and soul. A mere business arrangement, wasn't it, Sir Hugh? Remarked his visitor. Of course, I'm very sorry if any great trouble has fallen upon you on my account. I hope, for instance, you do not suspect me of conspiring to denounce your son-in-law, he added. Well, I don't know, was the other's reply. Yet I feel that, in view of this contretemps, I must in future break off all connection with you, and lose the annual grant which you find so extremely useful. I shall be compelled to do without it. And, at least, I shall have peace of mind. Perhaps, remarked the other meaningly. Sir Hugh realized that this man intended still to hold him in the hollow of his hand. From that one false step he had taken years ago he had never been able to draw back. Hour by hour, and day by day, had his conscience pricked him. Those chats with the doctor in that grimy little consulting room in Pimlico remained ever in his memory. The doctor was the representative of those who held him in their power, persons who were being continually hunted by the police, yet who always evaded them, criminals all. To insult him would be to insult those who had paid him so well for his confidential services. Yet, filled with contempt for himself, he asked whether he did not deserve to be degraded publicly and drummed out of the army. Were it not for Lady Elcombe and Enid, he would long ago have gone to East Africa and effaced himself. But he could not bring himself to desert them. He had satisfied himself that not a soul in England suspected the truth, for, by the press, he had long ago been declared to be a patriotic Briton, because in his stirring public speeches, when he had put up for Parliament after the armistice, there was always a genuine John Bull ring. The truth was that he remained unsuspected by all, save by one man who had scented the truth. That man was Walter Featherstone. Walter alone knew the ghastly circumstances, and it was he who had been working to save the old soldier from himself. He did so for two reasons. First, because he was fond of the bluff, fearless old fellow, and, secondly, because he had been attracted by Enid and intended to rescue her from the evil thraldom of Wearmarsh. "Why have you returned here to taunt and irritate me again?" snapped Sir Hugh after a pause. "I came to tell you news which, apparently, you have already received. You could well have kept it. You knew that I should be informed in due course." "Yes, but I thought you might grow apprehensive perhaps." "In what direction?" "That your connection with the little affair might be discovered by the French police. Bezard, the new chief of the Shoot, is a pretty shrewd person, remember." "But, surely, that is not possible, is it?" gasped the elder man in quick alarm. "No, you can reassure yourself on that point. Le Pontois knows nothing, therefore he can make no statement, unless, of course, your own actions were suspicious. They were not. I am convinced of that. Then you have no need to fear. Your son-in-law will certainly not endeavor to implicate you. And if he did, he would not be believed," declared the doctor, although he well knew that Bezard was in possession of full knowledge of the whole truth, and that, only by the timely warning he had so mysteriously received, had this man before him and his stepdaughter escaped arrest. His dastardly plot to secure their ruin and imprisonment had failed. How the girl had obtained wind of it utterly mystified him. It was really in order to discover the reason of their sudden flight that he had made those two visits. "Look here, Wearmarsh," exclaimed Sir Hugh with sudden resolution. "I wish you to understand that from today, once and for all, I desire to have no further dealings with you. It was, as you have said, a purely business transaction. Well, I have done the dirty, disgraceful work for which you have paid me, and now my task is at an end." "I hardly think it is, my dear Sir Hugh," replied the doctor calmly. "As I have said before, I am only the mouthpiece. I am not the employer. But I believe that certain further assistance is required. Information which you promised long ago, but failed to procure." "What was that?" "You recollect that you promised to obtain something, a little tittle-tattle, concerning a lady." "Yes," snapped the old officer. "Oh, Lady Wansford. Let us talk of something else." Wearmarsh, who had been narrowly watching the countenance of his victim, saw that he had mentioned a disagreeable subject. He noted how pale were the general's cheeks, and how his thin hands twitched with suppressed excitement. "I am quite ready to talk of other matters," he answered, "though I deem it but right to refer to my instructions." "And what are they?" "To request you to supply the promised information." "But I can't. I really can't. You made a promise, remember? And upon that promise I made you a loan of £500. "I know," cried the unhappy man, who had sunk so deeply into the mire that extrication seemed impossible. "I know, but it is a promise that I can't fulfill. I won't be your tool any longer. Gad, I won't. Don't you hear me?" "You must," declared Wearmarsh, bending forward and looking straight into his eyes. "I will not," shouted Sir Hugh, his eyes flashing with quick anger. "Anything but that. Why? My efforts in that direction had tragic results on the last occasion." "Ah," laughed Wearmarsh. "I see you are superstitious, or something. I did not expect that of you." "I'm not superstitious, Wearmarsh. I only refuse to do what you want. If I gave it to you, it would mean, no, I won't. I tell you I won't." "Bah! You are growing sentimental." "No, I am growing wise. My eyes are at last open to the dastardly methods of you and your infernal friends. Hear me, once and for all. I refuse to assist you further. And, moreover, I defy you." The doctor was silent for a moment, contemplating the ruby on his finger. Then, rising slowly from his chair, he said, "Ah, you do not fully realize what your refusal may cost you." "Cost what it may, Wearmarsh. I ask you to leave my house at once," said the general, scarlet with anger and beside himself with remorse. "And I shall give orders that you are not again to be admitted here." "Very good," laughed the other, with a sinister grin. You will very soon be seeking me in my surgery. We shall see, replied Sir Hugh, with a shrug of his shoulders, as the other strode out of his room. Chapter 22. Concerning the Bellairs affair. What Walter Featherstone had feared had happened. The two men had quarreled. Throughout the whole of that evening he watched the doctor's movements. In any other country but our dear old hoodwinked England, Featherstone, in the ordinary course, would have been the recipient of high honors from the sovereign. But he was a writer, and not a financier. He could not afford to subscribe to the party funds, a course suggested by the flat-footed old Lady G, who was the tout of government whips. Walter preferred to preserve his independence. He had seen and known much during the war, and, disgusted, he preferred to adopt the Canadian government's decree and remain without honors. His pet phrase was, "The extent of a party's dishonors is known by the honors it bestows." Scraps of ribbon, XYZ, or OBE behind one's name can neither make the gentleman nor create the lady. His secret connection with Scotland Yard, which was purely patriotic and conducted as a student of underground crime, had taught him many strange things, and he had learnt many remarkable secrets. Some of them were, indeed, his secrets before they became secrets of the cabinet. Many of those secrets he kept to himself, one being the remarkable truth that General Sir Hugh Elcombe was implicated in a very strange jumble of affairs, a matter that was indeed incredible. To the tall, well-groomed, military-looking man with whom he stood at 11 o'clock on the following morning, in a private room at New Scotland Yard, he had never confided that discovery of his. To have done so would have been to betray a man who had a brilliant record as a soldier, and who still held high position at the War Office. By such denunciation he knew he might earn from the eyes of the government very high commendation, in addition to what he had already earned. Yet he had resolved, if possible, to save the old officer, who was really more sinned against than sinning. "You seem to keep pretty close at the heels of your friend, the doctor of Vauxhall Bridge Road," laughed Trendall, the director of the department, as they stood together in the big, airy, official-looking room, the two long windows of which looked out over Westminster Bridge. "You've been in France, Montgomery says. What was your friend doing there?" "He's been there against his will, very much against his will. And you found out something, eh?" "Yes," replied Featherstone. "One or two things. Something interesting, of course," remarked the shrewd, active, dark-haired man of 50, under whose control was one of the most important departments of Scotland Yard. "But tell me, in what direction is this versatile doctor of yours working just at the present?" "I hardly know," was the novelist's reply. As in a navy serge suit he leaned near the window which overlooked the Thames. "I believe some deep scheme is afoot, but at present I cannot see very far. For that reason I am remaining watchful. He does not suspect you, of course? If he does, I'd give you Harris, or Charlesworth, or another of the men, in fact, whoever you like, to assist you. Perhaps I may require someone before long. If so, I will write or wire to the usual private box at the General Post Office, and shall then be glad if you will send a man to meet me." "Certainly. It was you, Featherstone, who first discovered the existence of this interesting doctor, who had already lived in Vauxhall Bridge Road for 18 months without arousing suspicion. You have, indeed, a fine nose for mysteries." At that moment the telephone, standing upon the big writing table, rang loudly, and the man of secrets crossed to it and listened. "It's Haywood, at Victoria Station. He's asking for you," he exclaimed. Walter went to the instrument, and through it heard the words, "The boat train has just gone, sir." Mrs. Caldwell waited for the young lady until the train went off, but she did not arrive. She seemed annoyed and disappointed. "Dr. Weirmarsh has been on the platform, evidently watching also." "Thanks, Haywood," replied Featherstone sharply. "That was all I wanted to know. Good day." He replaced the receiver, and, walking back to his friend against the window, explained, "A simple little inquiry I was making regarding a departure by the boat train for Paris. That was all." But he reflected that if Weirmarsh had been watching it must have been to warn the French police over at Calais of the coming of Enid. No action was too dastardly for that unscrupulous scoundrel. Yet, for the present at least, the girl remained safe. The chief peril was that in which Sir Hugh was placed, now that he had openly defied the doctor. On the previous evening he had been in the drawing-room at Hill Street when Sir Hugh had returned from interviewing the caller. By his countenance and manner he at once realized that the breach had been widened. The one thought by which he was obsessed was how he should save Sir Hugh from disgrace. His connection with the Criminal Investigation Department placed at his disposal a marvelous network of sources of information, amazing as they were unsuspected. He was secretly glad that at last the old fellow had resolved to face bankruptcy rather than go farther in that strange career of crime. Yet, at the same time, there was serious danger, for Weirmarsh was a man so unscrupulous and so vindictive that the penalty of his defiance must assuredly be a severe one. The very presence of the doctor on the platform of the southeastern station at Victoria that morning showed that he did not intend to allow the grass to grow beneath his feet. The novelist was still standing near the long window, looking aimlessly down upon the embankment, with its hurrying foot passengers and whirling taxis. "You seem unusually thoughtful, Featherstone," remarked Trendall with some curiosity, as he seated himself at the table and resumed the opening of his letters which his friend's visit had interrupted. "What's the matter?" "The fact is, I'm very much puzzled." "About what?" "You're generally very successful in obtaining solutions where other men have failed. To the problem which is greatly exercising my mind just now I can obtain no solution," he said in a low, intense voice. "What is it? Can I help you?" "Well," he exclaimed, with some hesitation, "I am still trying to discover why Harry Bellairs died and who killed him. That mystery has long ago been placed by us among those which admit of no solution, my dear fellow," declared his friend. "We did our best to throw some light upon it, but all to no purpose. I set the whole of our machinery at work at the time, days before you suspected anything wrong, but not a trace of the truth could we find. But what could have been the motive? Do you imagine? From all accounts he was a most popular young officer, without a single enemy in the world." "Jealousy," was the dark man's slow reply. "My own idea is that a woman killed him." "Why?" cried Walter quickly. "What causes you to make such a suggestion?" "Well, listen, and when I've finished you can draw your own conclusions." Chapter 23. The Silence of the Man Barker. "Harry Bellairs was an old friend of mine," Trendall went on, leaning back in his padded writing chair and turning towards where the novelist was standing. "His curious end was a problem which, of course, attracted you as a writer of fiction. The world believed his death to be due to natural causes, in view of the failure of Professors Dale and Boyd, the Home Office analysts, to find a trace of poison or of foul play." "You believe, then, that he was poisoned?" asked Featherstone quickly. The other shrugged his shoulders, saying, "How can that point be cleared up? There was no evidence of it. It is curious that, though we are both so intensely interested in the problem, we have never before discussed it," remarked Walter. "I am so anxious to hear your views upon one or two points." "What, for instance, do you think of Barker, the dead man's valet?" Herbert Trendall hesitated, and for a moment twisted his moustache. He was a marvelously alert man, an unusually good linguist, and a cosmopolitan to his fingertips. He had been a detective sergeant in the T Division of Metropolitan Police for years before his appointment as director of that section. He knew more of the criminal undercurrents on the continent than any living Englishman, and it was he who furnished accurate information to the Chute in Paris concerning the great Humbert swindle. "Well," he said, "if I recollect aright, the inquiries regarding him were not altogether satisfactory. Previous to his engagement by Harry he had, it seems, been valet to a man named Mitchell, a horse trainer of rather shady repute. Where is he now? I really don't know, but I can easily find out. I gave orders that he was not to be lost sight of." And, scribbling a hasty memorandum, he pressed the electric button upon the arm of his chair. His secretary, a tall, thin, deep-eyed man, entered, and to him he gave the note. "Well, let us proceed while they are looking up the information," the chief went on. "Harry Bellairs, as you know, was on the staff of Sir Hugh Elcombe, that dear, harmless old friend of yours who inspects troops and seems to do odd jobs for Whitehall. I knew Harry before he went to Sandhurst. His people, who lived up near Durham, were very civil to me once or twice and gave me some excellent pheasant shooting. It seems that on that day in September he came up to town from Salisbury. But you know all the facts, of course." "I know all the facts as far as they were related in the papers," Walter said. He did not reveal the results of the close, independent inquiries he had already made, results which had utterly astounded, and at the same time mystified, him. "Well," said Trendall, "what the press published was mostly fiction. Even the evidence given before the coroner was utterly unreliable. It was mainly given in order to mislead the jury and prevent public suspicion that there had been a sensational tragedy. I arranged it so. And there had been a tragedy, no doubt. Of course, declared the other, leaning both elbows upon the table before him and looking straight into the novelist's pale face. Harry came up from Salisbury, the bearer of some papers from Sir Hugh. He duly arrived at Waterloo, discharged his duty, and went to his rooms in Half Moon Street. Now, according to Barker's story, his master arrived home early in the afternoon and sent him out on a message to Richmond. He returned a little after 5, when he found his master absent. That was the account he gave at the inquest, remarked Featherstone. Yes, but it was not the truth. On testing the man's story, I discovered that at 3:18 he was in the Leicester Lounge, in Leicester Square, with an ill-dressed old man, who was described as being short and wearing a rusty, old silk hat. They sat at a table near the window drinking ginger ale, so that the barmaid could not overhear, and held a long and confidential chat. He may afterwards have gone down to Richmond, his friend suggested. No, he remained there until past 4, and then went round to the Café Royal, where he met another man, a foreigner of about his own age, believed to have been a Swiss, with whom he took a cup of coffee. The man was a stranger at the café, probably a stranger in London. Barker was in the habit of doing a little betting, and I believe the men he met were some of his betting friends. Then you disbelieve the Richmond story? Entirely. What seems more than probable is that Harry gave his man the afternoon off because he wished to entertain somebody clandestinely at his rooms. A woman, perhaps. Yet, as far as I've been able to discover, no one in Half Moon Street saw any stranger of either sex go to his chambers that afternoon. You said that you believed the motive of the crime, if crime it really was jealousy, remarked Featherstone, thoughtfully rubbing his shaven chin. And I certainly do. Harry was essentially a ladies' man. He was tall, and an extremely handsome fellow, a thoroughgoing sportsman, an excellent polo player, a perfect dancer, and a splendid rider to hounds. Little wonder was it that he was about to make a very fine match. For only a month before his death he confided to me in secret the fact, a fact known to me alone, that he was engaged to pretty little Lady Blanche Herbert, eldest daughter of the Earl of Worsborough. Engaged to Lady Blanche, echoed the novelist in surprise, for the girl in question was the prettiest of that year's debutantes as well as a great heiress in her own right. Yes, Harry was a lucky dog. Poor fellow. The engagement, known only to the Worsboroughs and myself, was to have been kept secret for a year. Now, it is my firm opinion, Featherstone, that some other woman, one of Harry's many female friends, had got wind of it, and very cleverly had her revenge. Upon what grounds do you suspect that? Asked the other eagerly. For surely the problem was becoming more inscrutable than any of those in the remarkable romances which he penned. Well, my conclusions are drawn from several very startling facts. Facts which, of course, have never leaked out to the public. But before I reveal them to you, I'd like to hear what opinion you formed yourself. I'm convinced that Harry Bellairs met with foul play, and I'm equally certain that the man Barker lied in his depositions before the coroner. He knows the whole story, and has been paid to keep a still tongue. There I entirely agree with you, Trendall declared quickly, while at that moment the secretary returned with a slip of paper attached to the query which his chief had written. Ah, he exclaimed, glancing at the paper, I see that the fellow Barker, who was a chauffeur before he entered Harry's service, has set up a motorcar business in Southampton. You believe him to have been an accessory, eh? Yes, a dupe in the hands of a clever woman. Of what woman? Asked Walter, holding his breath. As you know, Harry was secretary to your friend Elcombe. Well, I happen to know that his pretty stepdaughter, Enid Orlebar, was over head and ears in love with him. My daughter Ethel and she are friends, and she confided this fact to Ethel only a month before the tragedy. Then you actually suggest that a certain woman murdered him, gasped Featherstone. Well, there is no actual proof, only strong suspicion. Walter Featherstone held his breath. Did the suspicions of this man, from whom no secret was safe, run in the same direction as his own? There was in the evidence given before the coroner a suggestion that the captain had dined somewhere in secret, he said. I know, but we have since cleared up that point. He was not given poison while he sat at dinner, for we know that he dined at the Bachelor's with a man named Friend. They had a hurried meal, because Friend had to catch a train to the west of England, and afterwards, he left the club in a taxi at 8. But what his movements exactly were we cannot ascertain. He returned to his chambers at 9:15 in order to change his clothes and go back to Salisbury. but he was almost immediately taken ill. Barker declares that his master sent him out on an errand instantly on his return, and that when he came in he found him dying. Did he not explain what the errand was? No, he refused to say. In that refusal, Featherston saw that the valet, whatever might be his fault, was loyal to his dead master and to Enid Orlibar. He had not told how Bellairs had sent to Hill Street that scribbled note, and how the distressed girl had torn along to Half Moon Street to arrive too late to speak for the last time with a man she loved. Was Barker an enemy, or was he a friend? That refusal arouses distinct suspicion. Barker has very cleverly concealed some important fact, replied the keen-faced man who controlled that section of Scotland Yard. Bellairs, feeling deadly ill, and knowing that he had fallen a victim to some enemy, sent Barker out for somebody in whom to confide. The man claimed that the errand that his master sent him upon was one of confidence. And to whom do you think he was sent? To a woman, was Trendle's slow and serious reply. To the woman who murdered him. But if she had poisoned him, surely he would not send for her, exclaimed Featherston. At the moment he was not aware of the woman's jealousy, or of the subtle means used to cause his untimely end. He was unsuspicious of that cruel, deadly hatred lying so deep in the woman's breast. Lady Blanche, on hearing of the death of her lover, was terribly grieved, and is still abroad. She, of course, made all sorts of wild allegations, but in none of them did we find any basis of fact. Yet, curiously enough, her views were exactly the same as my own, that one of poor Harry's lady friends had been responsible for his fatal seizure. Then, after all the inquiries you instituted, you were really unable to point to the actual assassin? Asked Featherston rather more calmly. Not exactly unable. Unwilling, rather. How do you mean unwilling? You were Bellairs' friend. Yes, I was. He was one of the best and most noble fellows who ever wore the king's uniform, and he died by the treacherous hand of a jealous woman, a clever woman who had paid Barker to maintain silence. But, if the dying man wished to make a statement, he surely would not have sent for the very person by whose hand he had fallen, Featherston protested. Surely that is not a logical conclusion. Bellairs was not certain that his sudden seizure was not due to something he had eaten at the club. Remember, he was not certain that her hand had administered the fatal drug, replied Trendle. A hard, serious expression rested upon his face. He had, no doubt, seen her between the moment when he left the bachelor's and his arrival, a little over an hour afterwards, at Half Moon Street. Where, or how, we know not. Perhaps he drove to her house, and there, at her invitation, drank something. Yet, however it happened, the result was the same. She killed him, even though she was the first friend to whom he sent in his distress, killed him because she had somehow learnt of his secret engagement to Lady Blanche Herbert. Yours is certainly a remarkable theory, admitted Walter Featherston. May I ask the name of the woman to whom you refer? Yes, she was the woman who loved him so passionately, replied Trendle. Enid Orlibar. Then you really suspect her? Asked Featherston breathlessly. Only as far as certain facts are concerned, and that since Harry's death she has been unceasingly interested in the career of the man Barker. Are you quite certain of this? Gasped Featherston. Quite. It is proved beyond the shadow of a doubt. Then Enid Orlibar killed him. That if she actually did not kill him with her own hand, she at least knew well who did. Was the other's cold, hard reply. She killed him for two reasons. First, because by poor Harry's death she prevented the exposure of some great secret. Walter Featherston made no reply. Those inquiries, instituted by Scotland Yard, had resulted in exactly the same theory as his own independent efforts, that Harry Bellairs had been secretly done to death by the woman who, upon her own admission to him, had been summoned to the young officer's side. Chapter 24. What the Dead Man Left. It was news to Featherston that Bellairs had dined at his club on that fateful night. He had believed that Enid had dined with him. He had proved beyond all doubt that she had been to his rooms that afternoon during Barker's absence. That feather from the boa, and the perfume, were sufficient evidence of her visit. Yet why had Barker remained in the neighborhood of Piccadilly Circus if sent by his master with a message to Richmond? He could not doubt a single word that Trendle had told him, for the latter's information was beyond question. Well he knew with what care and cunning such an inquiry would have been made, and how every point would have been proved before being reported to that ever-active man who was head of that department of the Home Office that never sleeps. What secret do you suggest might have been divulged? He asked at last after a long pause. The big room the room of secrets, was silent, for the double windows prevented the noise of the traffic and the honk of the taxi horns from penetrating there. Only the low ticking of the clock broke the quiet. "I scarcely have any suggestion to offer in that direction," was Trendle's slow reply. "That feature of the affair still remains a mystery." "But cannot this man Barker be induced to make some statement?" he queried. "He will scarcely betray the woman to whom he owes his present prosperity, for he is prosperous and has a snug little balance at his bank. Besides, even though we took the matter in hand, what could we do? There is no evidence against him or against the woman." The farcical proceedings in the coroner's court had tied their hands. An open verdict was returned. Yes, at our suggestion. But Professors Dale and Boyd failed to find any traces of poison or of foul play. "And yet there was foul play. That is absolutely certain," declared the novelist. "Unfortunately, yes. Poor Bellairs was a brilliant and promising officer, a man destined to make a distinct mark in the world. It was a pity, perhaps, that he was such a lady killer. A pity that he fell victim to what was evidently a clever plot, and yet, I cannot bring myself to believe that your surmise can be actually correct. He surely would never have sent for the very person who was his enemy and who had plotted to kill him. It doesn't seem feasible, does it?" "Quite as feasible as any of the strange and crooked circumstances which one finds every day in life's undercurrents," was a quiet rejoinder. "Remember, he was very fond of her, fascinated by her remarkable beauty. But he was engaged to Lady Blanche. He intended to marry her, probably for wealth and position. The woman a man of Harry's stamp marries is seldom, if ever, the woman he loves," added the chief with a somewhat cynical smile, for he was essentially a man of the world. "But what secret could Enid Olibar desire to hide?" exclaimed Featherstone wonderingly. "If he loved her, he certainly would never have threatened exposure." "My dear fellow, I've told you briefly my own theory. A theory formed upon all the evidence I could collect," replied the tall, dark-eyed man, as he thrust his hands deeply into his trousers pockets and looked straight into the eyes of his friend. "If you are so certain that Enid Olibar is implicated in the affair, if not the actual assassin, why don't you interrogate her?" asked Walter boldly. Well, to tell the truth, our inquiries are not yet complete. When they are, we may be in a better position, we probably shall be, to put to her certain pointed questions. But," he added quickly, "perhaps I ought not to say this, for I know she is a friend of yours." "What you tell me is in confidence, as always, Trendle," he replied quickly. "I knew long ago that Enid was deeply attached to Bellairs. But much that you have just told me is entirely fresh to me. I must find Barker and question him." "I don't think I'd do that." "Wait until we have completed our inquiries," urged the other. "If Bellairs was killed in so secret and scientific a manner that no trace was left, he was killed with a cunning and craftiness which betrays a jealous woman rather than a man. Besides, there are other facts we have gathered which go further to prove that Enid Olibar is the actual culprit." "What are they? Tell me, Trelawney." "No, my dear chap. You are the lady's friend. It is really unfair to ask me," he protested. "Where the usual mysteries are concerned, I'm always open and above board with you. But in private investigations like this you must allow me to retain certain knowledge to myself." "But I beg of you to tell me everything," demanded the other. "I have taken an intense interest in the matter, as you have, even though my motive has been of an entirely different character. You have no suspicion that Bellairs was in possession of any great secret, a secret which it was to Miss Olibar's advantage should be kept." "No," was the novelist's prompt response. "But I can't see the drift of your question," he added. "Well," replied the keen, alert man, who, again seated in his writing chair, bent slightly towards his visitor. "Well, as you've asked me to reveal all I know, Featherstone, I will do so, even though I feel some reluctance, in face of the fact that Miss Olibar is your friend." "That makes no difference," declared the other firmly. "I am anxious to clear up the mystery of Bellairs' death." "Then I think that you need seek no farther for the correct solution," replied Trendle quietly, looking into the other's pale countenance. "Your lady friend killed him, in order to preserve her own secret." "But what was her secret?" "We have that yet to establish. It must have been a serious one for her to close his lips in such a manner." "But they were good friends," declared Featherstone. "He surely had not threatened to expose her." "I do not think he had. My own belief is that she became madly jealous of Lady Blanche, and at the same time, Fearing the exposure of her secret to the woman to whom her lover had become engaged, she took the subtle means of silencing him. Besides, and he paused without concluding his sentence. Besides what? From the first you suspected Sir Hugh's stepdaughter, eh? Featherstone hesitated. Then afterwards he nodded slowly in the affirmative. Yes, went on Trendall. I knew all along that you were suspicious. You made a certain remarkable discovery, eh, Featherstone? The novelist started. At what did his friend hint? Was it possible that the inquiries had led to a suspicion of Sir Hugh's criminal conduct? The very thought appalled him. Well, in the course of the inquiries I made I found that the lady in question was greatly attached to the dead man, replied Featherstone rather lamely. Trendall smiled. It was to Enid Olibar that Harry sent when he felt his fatal seizure. Instead of sending for a doctor, he sent Barker to her, and she at once flew to his side. But, alas, too late to remedy the harm she had already caused. When she arrived he was dead. Featherstone was silent. He saw that the inquiries made by the Criminal Investigation Department had led to exactly the same conclusion that he himself had formed. This is a most distressing thought. That Enid Olibar is a murderess, he declared after a moment's pause. It is, I admit. Yet we cannot close our eyes to such outstanding facts. My dear chapter, depend upon it that there is something behind the poor fellow's death of which we have no knowledge. In his death your friend Miss Olibar sought safety. The letter he wrote to her a week before his assassination is sufficient evidence of that. A letter? Gasped Featherstone. Is there one in existence? Yes, it is in our possession. It reveals the existence of the secret. But what was its nature? Cried Featherstone in dismay. What terrible secret could there possibly be that could only be preserved by Bellaire's silence? That's just the puzzle we have to solve. Just the very point which has mystified us all along. And then he turned to his correspondence again, opening his letters one after the other. Letters which, addressed to a box at the General Post Office in the city, contained secret information from various unsuspected quarters at home and abroad. Suddenly, in order to change the topic of conversation, which he knew was painful to Walter Featherstone, he mentioned the excellence of the opera at Covent Garden on the previous night. And afterwards he referred to an article in that day's paper which dealt with the idea of obtaining exclusive political intelligence through spirit bureaus. Then, speaking of the labor unrest, Trendall pronounced his opinion as follows. The whole situation would be ludicrous were it not urged so persistently as to be a menace not so much in this country, where we know too well the temperaments of its sponsors, but abroad, where public opinion, imperfectly instructed, may imagine it represents a serious national feeling. The continuance of it is an intolerable negation of civilization. It is supported by no public men of credit. It has been disproved again and again. Ridicule may be left to give the menace the coup de grace. And this, he laughed, in face of what you and I know, eh? How long will the British public be lulled to sleep by anonymous scribblers? One day they'll have a rude awakening, declared Featherstone, still thinking, however, of that letter of the dead man to Enid. I wonder, he added, I wonder who inspires these denials? We know, of course, that each time anything against enemy interests appears in a certain section of the press, there arises a ready army of letter-writers who rush into print and append their names to assurances that the enemy is nowadays our best friend. Those patriotic Englishmen are, many of them, in high positions. When responsible papers willfully mislead the public, what can be expected? Walter went on. But, he added after a pause, we did not arrive at any definite conclusion regarding the tragic death of Bellairs. What about that letter of his? Trendall was thoughtful for a few minutes. My conclusion, the only one that can be formed, he answered at last, disregarding his friend's question, is that Enid Olibar is the guilty person, and before long I hope to be in possession of that secret which she strove by her crime to suppress, a secret which I feel convinced we shall discover to be one of an amazing character. Walter stood motionless as a statue. Surely Bellairs had not died by Enid's hand. Chapter 25. At the Café de Paris. It was in the early days of January, damp and foggy in England. Walter Featherstone sat idling on the terrace of the Café de Paris in Monte Carlo sipping a Mazagran, basking in the afternoon sunshine, and listening to the music of the Romanian orchestra. Around him everywhere was the gay cosmopolitan world of the tables, that giddy little after-the-war financier and profiteer world which amuses itself on the Côte d'Azur, and in which he was such a well-known figure. So many successive seasons had he passed there before 1914 that across at the rooms the attendants and croupiers knew him as an habitué, and he was always granted the carte blanche, the white card of the professional gambler. With nearly half the people he met he had a nodding acquaintance, for friendships are easily formed over the tapis vert, and as easily dropped. Preferring the fresher air of Nice, he made his headquarters at the Hotel Royal on the world-famed promenade, and came over to Montet daily by the Rapide. Much had occurred since that autumn morning when he had stood with Herbert Trendall in the big room at New Scotland Yard. Much that had puzzled him, much that had held him in fear lest the ghastly truth concerning Sir Hugh should be revealed. His own activity had been, perhaps, unparalleled. The strain of such constant travel and continual excitement would have broken most men, but he possessed an iron constitution, and though he spent weeks on end in trains and steamboats, it never affected him in the least. He could snatch sleep at any time, and he could write anywhere. Whether or not Enid had guessed the reason of his urgent appeal to her not to pass through France, she had nevertheless managed to excuse herself. But a week after Mrs. Caldwell's departure she had travelled alone by the Harwich-Antwerp route, evidently much to the annoyance of the alert Doctor of Pimlico. Walter had impressed upon her the desirability of not entering France, without, however, giving any plain reason. He left her to guess. Through secret sources in Paris he had learnt how poor Paul Le Pontois was still awaiting trial. In order not to excite public opinion, the matter was being kept secret by the French authorities, and it had been decided that the inquiry should be held with closed doors. A week after his arrest the French police received additional evidence against him in the form of a cryptic telegram addressed to the chateau, an infamous and easily deciphered message which, no doubt, had been sent with a distinct purpose of strengthening the amazing charge against him. He protested entire ignorance of the sender and of the meaning of the message, but his accusers would not accept any disclaimer. So cleverly, indeed, had the message been worded that at the short it was believed to refer to the price he had received for certain bundles of spurious notes. Without a doubt the scandalous telegram had been sent at Wearmouth's instigation by one of his friends in order to influence the authorities in Paris. So far as the doctor was concerned he was ever active in receiving reports from his cosmopolitan friends abroad. But since his quarrel with Sir Hugh he had ceased to visit Hill Street, and had, apparently, dropped the old general's acquaintance. Sir Hugh was congratulating himself at the easy solution of the difficulty. But Walter, seated at that little marble-topped table in the winter sunshine, knowing Wearmouth's character, remained in daily apprehension. The exciting life he led in assisting to watch those whom Scotland Yard suspected was as nothing compared with the constant fear of the unmasking of Sir Hugh Elcombe. Dr. Wearmouth was an enemy, and a formidable one. The mystery concerning the death of Bellairs had increased rather than diminished. Each step he had taken in the inquiry only plunged him deeper and deeper into an inscrutable problem. He had devoted weeks to endeavoring to solve the mystery, but it remained, alas, inscrutable. Enid and Mrs. Caldwell had altered their plans, and had gone to Sicily instead of to Egypt, first visiting Palermo and Syracuse, and were at the moment staying at the popular San Domenico at Taormina, amid that gem of Mediterranean scenery. Sir Hugh and his wife, much upset by Blanche's sudden arrival in London, had not gone abroad that winter, but had remained at Hill Street to comfort Paul's wife and child. As for Walter, he had of late been wandering far afield, in Petrograd, Geneva, Rome, Florence, Malaga, and for the past week had been at Monte Carlo. He was not there wholly for pleasure, for, if the truth be told, there were seated at the farther end of the terrace a smartly dressed man and a woman in whom he had for the past month been taking a very keen interest. This pair, of Swiss nationality, he had watched in half a dozen continental cities, gradually establishing his suspicions as to their real occupation. They had come to Monte Carlo for neither health nor pleasure, but in order to meet a grey-haired man in spectacles, whom they received twice in private at the Metropole, where they were staying. The Englishman had first seen them sitting together one evening at one of the marble-topped tables at the Café Royal in Regent Street, while he had been idly playing a game of dominoes at the next table with an American friend. The face of the man was to him somehow familiar. He felt that he had seen it somewhere, but whether in a photograph in his big album down at Idsworth or in the flesh he could not decide. Yet from that moment he had hardly lost sight of them. With that astuteness which was Featherstone's chief characteristic, he had watched vigilantly and patiently, establishing the fact that the pair were in England for some sinister purpose. His powers were little short of marvelous. He really seemed, as Trendall once put it, to scent the presence of criminals as pigs scent truffles. They suddenly left the Midland Hotel at St. Pancras, where they were staying, and crossed the Channel. But the same boat carried Walter Featherston, who took infinite care not to obtrude himself upon their attention. Monte Carlo, being in the Principality of Monaco, and being peopled by the most cosmopolitan crowd in the whole world, is in winter the recognized meeting place of chevaliers d'industry and those who finance and control great crimes. In the big atrium of those stifling rooms, many an assassin has met his hirer, and in many of those fine hotels have bribes been handed over to those who will do dirty work. It is the European exchange of criminality, for both sexes know it to be a safe place where they may accidentally meet the person controlling them. It is safe to say that in every code used by the criminal plotters of every country in Europe there is a cryptic word which signifies a meeting at Monte Carlo. For that reason was Walter Featherston much given to idling on the sunny terrace of the cafe at a point where he could see every person who ascended or descended that flight of red-carpeted stairs which gives entrance to the rooms. The pair whom he was engaged in watching had been playing at roulette with 5-franc pieces, and the woman was now counting her gains and laughing gaily with her husband as she slowly sipped her tea flavored with orange flower water. They were in ignorance of the presence of that lynx-eyed man in grey flannels and straw hat who smoked his cigarette leisurely and appeared to be so intensely bored. No second glance at Featherston was needed to ascertain that he was a most thoroughgoing cosmopolitan. He usually wore his pale grey felt hat at a slight angle, and had the air of the easygoing adventurer, debonair and unscrupulous. But in his case his appearance was not a true index to his character, for in reality he was a steady, hard-headed, intelligent man, the very soul of honor, and, above all, a man of intense patriotism, an Englishman to the backbone. Still, he cultivated his easygoing cosmopolitanism to pose as a careless adventurer. Presently the pair rose, and, crossing the palm-lined place, entered the casino, while Walter, finishing his mazagran, lit a fresh cigarette, and took a turn along the front of the casino in order to watch the pigeon shooting. The winter sun was sinking into the tideless sea in all its gold and orange glory as he stood leaning over the stone balustrade watching the splendid marksmanship of one of the crack shots of Europe. He waited until the contest had ended. Then he descended and took the rapide back to Nice for dinner. At 9 o'clock he returned to Monte Carlo and again ascended the station lift, as was his habit, for a stroll through the rooms and a chat and drink with one or other of his many friends. He looked everywhere for the Swiss pair in whom he was so interested, but in vain. Probably they had gone over to Nice to spend the evening, he thought. But as the night wore on and they did not return by the midnight train, the arrival of which he watched, he strolled back to the Metropole and inquired for them at the bureau of the hotel. Monsieur and Madame Grenier left by the Mediterranean Express for Paris at 7:15 this evening, replied the clerk, who knew Walter very well. What address did they leave? He inquired, annoyed at the neat manner in which they had escaped his vigilance. They left no address, monsieur. They received a telegram just after 6 o'clock recalling them to Paris immediately. Fortunately, there was one two-berth compartment vacant on the train. Walter turned away full of chagrin. He had been foolish to lose sight of them. His only course was to return to Nice, pack his traps, and follow to Paris in the ordinary rapide at 8 o'clock next morning. And this was the course he pursued. But Paris is a big place, and though he searched for 2 whole weeks, going hither and thither to all places where the foreign visitors mostly congregate, he saw nothing of the interesting pair. Therefore, full of disappointment, he crossed one afternoon to Folkestone, and that night again found himself in his dingy chambers in Holles Street. Next day he called upon Sir Hugh, and found him in much better spirits. Lady Elcombe told him that Enid had written expressing herself delighted with her season in Sicily, and saying that both she and Mrs. Caldwell were very pleased that they had adopted his suggestion of going there instead of to overcrowded Cairo. As he sat with Sir Hugh and his wife in that pretty drawing-room he knew so well, the old general suddenly said, "I suppose, Featherston, you are still taking as keen an interest in the latest mysteries of crime, eh?" "Yes, Sir Hugh. As you know, I've written a good deal upon the subject. I've read a good many of your books and articles." "Of course," exclaimed the old officer. "Upon many points I entirely agree with you," he said. "There is a curious case in the papers today. Have you seen it? A young girl found mysteriously shot dead near Hitchin." "No, I haven't," was Walter's reply. He was not at all interested. He was thinking of something of far greater interest. Chapter 26. Which is private and confidential. At 11 o'clock next morning, Featherstone stood in Trendle's room at Scotland Yard reporting to him the suspicious movements of Monsieur and Madame Grenier. His friend leaned back in his padded chair listening while the keen-faced man in pince-nez related all the facts, and in doing so showed how shrewd and astute he had been. "Then they are just what we thought," remarked the chief. "Without a doubt. In Monte Carlo they received further instructions from somebody. They went to Paris, and there I lost them." Trendle smiled, for he saw how annoyed his friend was at their escape. "Well, you certainly clung on to them," he said. "When you first told me your suspicions, I confess I was inclined to disagree with you. You merely met them casually in Regent Street. What made you suspicious?" "One very important incident. Wearmarsh came in with another man, and, in passing, nodded to Grenier. That set me thinking, but you do not know of any actual dealings with the doctor." "I know of none," replied Walter. "Still, I'm very sick that, after all my pains, they should have escaped to Paris so suddenly." "Never mind," said Trendle. "If they are what we suspect, we shall pick them up again before long, no doubt. Now look here," he added. "Read that. It's just come in. As you know, any foreigner who takes a house in certain districts nowadays is reported to us by the local police." Featherstone took the big sheet of blue official paper which the police official handed to him, and found that it was the copy of a confidential report made by the superintendent of police at Malden, in Essex, and read as follows. "I, William Warden, Superintendent of Police for the Borough of Malden, desire to report to the Commissioner of Metropolitan Police the following statement from Sergeant S. Deacon, Essex Constabulary, stationed at Southminster, which is as below. On Friday, the 13th of September last, a gentleman, evidently a foreigner, was sent by Messrs. Hare and James, estate agents, of Malden, to view the house known as the Yews, at Ashildham, in the vicinity of Southminster, and agreed to take it for 3 years in order to start a poultry farm. The tenant entered into possession a week later, when one vanload of furniture arrived from London. 2 days later, 3 other vanloads arrived late in the evening, and were unpacked in the stable yard at dawn. The tenant, whose name is Bailey, but whose letters come addressed Bailey, and are mostly from Belgium, lived there alone for a fortnight, and was afterwards joined by a foreign manservant named Pietro, who is believed to be an Italian. Though more than 3 months have elapsed, and I have kept observation upon the house, a large one, standing in its own grounds, I have seen no sign of poultry farming, and therefore deem it a matter for a report. Samuel Deacon, Sergeant, Essex Constabulary. "Curious," remarked Walter, when he had finished reading it. "Yes," said Trendle. "There may be nothing in it. It should be inquired into," declared Walter. "I'll take Summers and go down there to have a look round, if you like." "I wish you would," said the chief. "I'll phone Summers to meet you at Liverpool Street Station," he added, turning to the railway guide. "There's a train at 1:45. Will that suit you?" "Yes. Tell him to meet me at Liverpool Street, and we'll see who this Mr. Bailey really is." When, shortly after 1:30, the novelist walked onto the platform at Liverpool Street, he was approached by a narrow-faced, middle-aged man in a blue serge suit who presented the appearance of a ship's engineer on leave. As they sat together in a first-class compartment, Featherstone explained to his friend the report made by the police officer at Southminster, the next station to Burnham-on-Crouch, whereupon Summers remarked, "The doctor has been down this way once or twice of late. I wonder if he goes to pay this Mr. Bailey, or Bailey, a visit." "Perhaps," laughed Walter. "We shall see." The railway ended at Southminster, but on alighting they had little difficulty in finding the small police station, where the local sergeant of police awaited them, having been warned by telephone. "Well, gentlemen," said the red-faced man, spreading his big hands on his knees as they sat together in a back room, "Mr. Bailey ain't at home just now. He's away a lot. The house is a big one, not too big for the 4 vanloads of furniture what came down from London. Has he made any friends in the district? Do you know?" "No, not exactly. He often goes and has a drink at the Bridgewick Arms at Burnham, close by the Coast Guard station." Walter exchanged a meaning glance with his assistant. "Does he receive any visitors?" "Very few. He's away such a lot. A woman comes down to see him sometimes. His sister, they say she is." "What kind of a woman?" "Oh, she's a lady about 35, beautifully dressed always. She generally comes in a dark green motor car, which she drives herself. She was a lady driver during the war. Do you know her name?" "Miss Bailey. She's a foreigner, of course. Any other visitors? Asked Featherstone, in his quick, impetuous way, as he polished his pince-nez. One day, very soon after Mr. Bailey took the house, I was on duty at Southminster Station in the forenoon, and a gentleman and lady arrived and asked how far it was to the U's at Ashildham. I directed them the way to walk over by Newmoor and across the brook. Then I slipped home, got into plain clothes, and went along after them by the footpath. Why did you do that? Asked Summers. Because I wanted to find out something about this foreigner's visitors. I read at headquarters at Malden the new instructions about reporting all foreigners who took houses, and I wanted to show that you were on the alert. Eh, Deacon? Laughed the novelist good-humoredly, and he lit a cigarette. That's so, sir, replied the big, red-faced man. Well, I took a shortcut over to the U's and got there 10 minutes before they did. I hid in the hedge on the north side of the house, and saw that as soon as they walked up the drive, Mr. Bailey rushed out to welcome them. The lady seemed very nervous, I thought. I know she was an English lady, because she spoke to me at the station. What were they like? Inquired Summers. Describe both of them. Well, the man, as far as I can recollect, was about 50 or so, grey-faced, dark-eyed, wearing a heavy overcoat with astrakhan collar and cuffs. He had light grey suede gloves, and carried a gold-mounted Malacca cane with a curved handle. The woman was quite young, not more than 20, I should think, and very good-looking. She wore a neat tailor-made dress of brown cloth and a small black velvet hat with a big gold buckle. She had a greyish fur around her neck, with a muff to match, and carried a small, dark green leather bag. Walter stood staring at the speaker. The description was exactly that of Wearmarsh and Enid Orlebar. The doctor often wore an astrakhan-trimmed overcoat, while both dress and hat were the same which Enid had worn 3 months ago. He made a few quick inquiries of the red-faced sergeant, but the man's replies only served to convince him that Enid had actually been a visitor at the mysterious house. You did not discover their names? The young lady addressed her companion as Doctor. That's all I know, was the officer's reply. For that reason I was rather inclined to think that I was on the wrong scent. The man was perhaps, after all, only a doctor who had come down to see his patient. Perhaps so, remarked Walter mechanically. You say Mr. Bailey is not at home today, so we'll just run over and have a look round. You'd better come with us, Sergeant. Very well, sir. But I hear as how Mr. Bailey is coming home this evening. I met Pietro in the railway inn at Southminster the night before last, and casually asked when his master was coming home, as I wanted to see him for a subscription for our police concert, and he told me that the Signore, that's what he called him, was coming home tonight. Good. Then, after a look round the place, we hope to have the pleasure of seeing this mysterious foreigner who comes here to the Dengie marshes to make a living out of fowl keeping. And Walter smiled meaningly at his companion. 10 minutes later, after the sergeant had changed into plain clothes, the trio set out along the flat, muddy road for Ashildham. But as they were walking together, after passing North End, a curious thing happened. Summers started back suddenly and nudged the novelist's arm without a word. Featherstone, looking in the direction indicated, halted, utterly staggered by what met his gaze. It was inexplicable, incredible. He looked again, scarcely believing his own eyes, for what he saw made plain a ghastly truth. He stood rigid, staring straight before him. Was it possible that at last he was actually within measurable distance of the solution of the mystery? Chapter 27. The Result of Investigation. As the expectant trio had come round the bend in the road, they saw in front of them, walking alone, a young lady in a short tweed suit with hat to match. The gown was of a peculiar shade of grey, and by her easy, swinging gait and the graceful carriage of her head, Walter Featherstone instantly recognized that there before him, all unconscious of his presence, was the girl he believed to be still in Sicily, Enid Orlebar. He looked again, to satisfy himself that he was not mistaken. Then, drawing back, lest her attention should be attracted by their footsteps, he motioned to his companions to retreat around the bend and thus out of her sight. Now, he said, addressing them, there is some deep mystery here. That lady must not know we are here. You've recognized her, sir? Asked Summers, who had on several previous occasions assisted him. Yes, was the novelist's hard reply. She is here with some mysterious object. You mustn't approach the U's till dark. Mr. Bailey will then be at home, sir, remarked the sergeant. I thought you wished to explore the place before he arrived. Walter paused. He saw that Enid could not be on her way to visit Bailey if he were not at home. So he suggested that Summers, whom she did not know, should go forward and watch her movements, while he and the sergeant should proceed to the house of suspicion. Arranging to meet later, the officer from Scotland Yard lit his pipe and strolled quickly forward around the bend to follow the girl in grey, while the other two halted to allow them to get on ahead. "Have you ever seen that lady down here before, Sergeant?" asked Walter presently. "Yes, sir. If I don't make a mistake, it is the same lady who asked me the way to the U's soon after Mr. Bailey took the house, the lady who came with the man whom she addressed as Doctor." "Are you quite certain of this?" "Not quite certain. She was dressed differently, in brown, with a different hat and a veil. They came only on that one occasion, eh?" "Only that once, sir. But why? I wonder, is she going to the U's?" "Pietro, you say, went up to London this morning?" "Yes, sir, by the 9:05. And the house is locked up. She's evidently unaware of that. No doubt. She'll go there, and, finding nobody at home, turn away disappointed. She must not see us. We'll take good care of that, sir," laughed the local sergeant breezily, as he left his companion's side and crossed the road so that he could see the bend. "Why," he exclaimed, "she ain't going to Esheldham after all. She's taken the footpath to the left that leads into Steeple. Evidently she knows the road. Then we are free to go straight along to the U's, eh? She's making a call in the vicinity. I wonder where she's going." "Your friend will ascertain that," said the sergeant. "Let's get along to the U's and have a peep round." Therefore the pair, now that Enid was sufficiently far ahead along a footpath which led under a high, bare hedge, went forth again down the high road until, after crossing the brook, they turned to the right into Asheldham village, where, halfway between that place and Newhall, they turned up a short by-road, a cul-de-sac, at the end of which a big, old-fashioned, red-brick house of the days of Queen Anne, half hidden by a belt of high Scotch firs, came into view. Shut off from the by-road by a high, time-mellowed brick wall, it stood back lonely and secluded in about a couple of acres of well-wooded ground. From a big, rusty iron gate the ill-kept, gravel drive took a broad sweep up to the front of the house, a large, roomy one with square, inartistic windows and plain front, the ugliness of which the ivy strove to hide. In the grey light of that wintry afternoon the place looked inexpressibly dismal and neglected. Years ago it had, no doubt, been the residence of some well-to-do county family. But in these 20th century post-war days, having been empty for nearly 10 years, it had gone sadly to rack and ruin. The lawns had become weedy, the carriage drive was, in places, green with moss, like the sills of the windows and the high-pitched, tiled roof itself. In the center of the lawn, before the house, stood 4 great ancient yews, while all round were high box hedges, now, alas, neglected, untrimmed and full of holes. The curtains were of the commonest kind, while the very steps leading to the front door were grey with lichen and strewn with wisps of straw. The whole aspect was one of neglect, of decay, of mystery. The two men, opening the creaking iron gate, advanced boldly to the door, an excuse ready in case Pietro opened it. They knocked loudly, but there was no response. Their summons echoed through the big hall, causing Walter to remark, "There can't be much furniture inside, judging from the sound." "4 motor van loads came here," responded the sergeant. "The first was in a plain van. You did not discover whence it came." "I asked the driver down at the inn at Southminster, and he told me that they came from the Trinity Furnishing Company, Peckham. But, on making inquiries, I found that he lied. There is no such company in Peckham." "You saw the furniture unloaded?" "I was about here when the first lot came. When the other 3 vans arrived I was away on my annual leave," was the sergeant's reply. Again they knocked, but no one came to the door. A terrier approached, but he proved friendly. Therefore they proceeded to make an inspection of the empty stabling and disused outbuildings. 3 old hen coops were the only signs of poultry farming they could discover, and these, placed in a conspicuous position in the big, paved yard, were without feathered occupants. There were 3 doors by which the house could be entered, and all of them Walter tried and found locked. Therefore, noticing in the rubbish heap some stray pieces of paper, he at once turned his attention to what he discovered were fragments of a torn letter. It was written in French, and, apparently, had reference to certain securities held by the tenant of the use. But as only a small portion of the destroyed communication could be found, its purport was not very clear, and the name and address of the writer could not be ascertained. Yet it had already been proved without doubt that the mysterious tenant of the dismal old place, the man who posed as a poultry farmer, had had as visitors Dr. Weirmarsh and Enid Orlebar. For a full half-hour, while the red-faced sergeant kept watch at the gate, Walter Featherstone continued to investigate that rubbish heap, which showed signs of having been burning quite recently, for most of the scraps of paper were charred at their edges. The sodden remains of many letters he withdrew and tried to read, but the scraps gave no tangible result, and he was just about to relinquish his search when his eye caught a scrap of bright blue notepaper of a familiar hue. It was half-burned and blurred by the rain, but at the corner he recognized some embossing in dark blue. Familiar embossing it was, of part of the address in Hill Street. The paper was that used habitually by Enid Orlebar, and upon it was a date, 2 months before, and the single word over in her familiar handwriting. He took his stout walking stick, in reality a sword case, and frantically searched for other scraps, but could find none. One tiny portion only had been preserved from the flames, paraffin having been poured over the heap to render it the more inflammable. But that scrap in itself was sufficient proof that Enid had written to the mysterious tenant of the use. "Well," he said at last, approaching the sergeant, "do you think the coast is clear enough?" "For what?" "To get a glimpse inside. There's a good deal more mystery here than we imagine. Depend upon it," Walter exclaimed. "Master and man will return by the same train, I expect, unless they come back in a motorcar. If they come by train, they won't be here till well past 8, so we'll have at least 3 hours by ourselves." Walter Featherstone glanced around. Twilight was fast falling. "It'll be dark inside, but I've brought my electric torch," he said. "There's a kitchen window with an ordinary latch. That's no use." "There are iron bars," declared the sergeant. "I examined it the other day. The small staircase window at the side is the best means of entry." And he took the novelist round and showed him a long narrow window about 5 feet from the ground. Walter's one thought was of Enid. Why had she written to that mysterious foreigner? Why had she visited there? Why, indeed, was she back in England surreptitiously, and in that neighborhood? The short winter's afternoon was nearly at an end as they stood contemplating the window prior to breaking in. For Walter Featherstone felt justified in breaking the law in order to examine the interior of that place. In the dark branches of the trees the wind whistled mournfully, and the scudding clouds were precursory of rain. "Great Scott!" exclaimed Walter. "This isn't a particularly cheerful abode, is it, Sergeant?" "No, sir. If I lived ere I'd have the blues in a week," laughed the man. "I can't think Mr. Bailey employs his time." "Poultry farming," laughed Featherstone, as, standing on tiptoe, he examined the window latch by flashing on the electric torch. "No good," he declared. "There's a shutter covered with new sheet iron behind." "It doesn't show through the curtain," exclaimed Deacon. "But it's there. Our friend is evidently afraid of burglars." From window to window they passed, but the mystery was considerably increased by the discovery that at each of those on the ground floor were iron-faced shutters, though so placed as not to be noticeable behind the windows, which were entirely covered with cheap curtain muslin. "That's funny," exclaimed the sergeant. "I've never examined them with a light before." "They have all been newly strengthened," declared Featherstone. "On the other side I expect there are strips of steel placed lattice-wise, a favorite device of foreigners. Mr. Bailey," he added, "evidently has no desire that any intruder should gain access to his residence." "What shall we do?" asked Deacon, for it was now rapidly growing dark. A thought had suddenly occurred to Walter that perhaps Enid's intention was to make a call there, after all. "Our only way to obtain entrance is, I think, by one of the upper windows," replied the man whose very life was occupied by the investigation of mysteries. "In the laundry I noticed a ladder. Let us go and get it." So the ladder, a rather rotten and insecure one, was obtained, and after some difficulty placed against the wall. It would not, however, reach to the windows, as first intended. Therefore Walter mounted upon the slippery, moss-grown tiles of a wing of the house, and after a few moments' exploration discovered a skylight which proved to be over the head of the servants' staircase. This he lifted, and, fixing around a chimney stack a strong silk rope he had brought in his pocket ready for any emergency, he threw it down the opening, and quickly lowered himself through. Scarcely had he done so, and was standing on the uncarpeted stairs, when his quick ear caught the sound of Deacon's footsteps receding over the gravel around to the front of the house. Then, a second later, he heard a loud challenge from the gloom in a man's voice that was unfamiliar. "Who's there?" There was no reply. Walter listened with bated breath. "What are you doing there?" cried the newcomer in a voice in which was a marked foreign accent. "Speak, speak, or I'll shoot." Chapter 28. The Secret of the Lonely House. Walter did not move. He realized that a contretemps had occurred. The ladder still leaning against the wall outside would reveal his intrusion. Yet, at last inside, he intended, at all hazards, to explore the place and learn the reason why the mysterious stranger had started that poultry farm. He was practically in the dark, fearing to flash on his torch lest he should be discovered. Was it possible that Bailey or his Italian manservant had unexpectedly returned? Those breathless moments seemed hours. Suddenly he heard a second challenge. The challenger used a fierce Italian oath, and by it he knew that it was Pietro. In reply, a shot rang out, evidently from the sergeant's pistol, followed by another sharp report, and still another. This action showed the man Deacon to be a shrewd person, for the effect was exactly as he had intended. The Italian servant turned on his heel and flew for his life down the drive, shouting in his native tongue for help and for the police. "Madonna Santa!" he yelled. "Who are you here?" he demanded in Italian. "I'll go to the police." And in terror he rushed off down the road. "All right, sir," cried the sergeant, after the servant had disappeared. "I've given the fellow a good fright. Be quick and have a look round, sir. You can be out again before he raises the alarm." In an instant Walter flashed on his torch and, dashing down the stairs, crossed the kitchen and found himself in the hall. From room to room he rushed, but found only 2 rooms on the ground floor furnished. A sitting room, which had been the original dining room, while in the study was a chair bed, most probably where Pietro slept. On the table lay a heavy revolver, fully loaded, and this Featherston quickly transferred to his jacket pocket. Next moment he dashed up the old well staircase 2 steps at a time and entered room after room. Only one was furnished, the tenant's bedroom. In it he found a number of suits of clothes, while on the dressing table lay a false mustache, evidently for disguise. A small writing table was set in the window, and upon it was strewn a quantity of papers. As he flashed his torch round, he was amazed to see, arranged upon a neat deal table in a corner, some curious-looking machinery which looked something like printing presses. But they were a mystery to him. The discovery was a strange one. What it meant he did not then realize. There seemed to be quite a quantity of apparatus and machinery. It was this which had been conveyed there in those furniture vans of the Trinity Furnishing Company. He heard Deacon's voice calling again. Therefore, having satisfied himself as to the nature of the contents of that neglected old house, he ascended the stone steps into the passage which led through a faded green baize door into the main hall. As he entered he heard voices in loud discussion. Sergeant Deacon and the servant Pietro had met face to face. The Italian had evidently aroused the villagers in Asheldham, for there were sounds of many voices of men out on the gravel drive. "I came up here a quarter of an hour ago," the Italian cried excitedly in his broken English, "and somebody fired at me. They tried to kill me." "But who?" asked Deacon in pretended ignorance. He was uncertain what to do, Mr. Featherston being still within the house and the ladder, his only means of escape, still standing against the side wall. "Thieves!" cried the man, his foreign accent more pronounced in his excitement. "I challenged them, and they fired at me. I am glad that you, a police sergeant, are here." "So am I," cried Walter Featherston, suddenly throwing open the front door and standing before the knot of alarmed villagers, though it was so dark that they could not recognize who he was. "Deacon," he added authoritatively, "arrest that foreigner." "Diavolo! Who are you?" demanded the Italian angrily. "You will know in due course," replied Featherston. Then, turning to the crowd, he added, "Gentlemen, I came here with Sergeant Deacon to search this house. He will tell you whether that statement is true or not." "Quite," declared the breezy sergeant, who already had the Italian by the collar and coat sleeve. "It was I who fired, to frighten him off." At this the crowd laughed. They had no liking for foreigners of any sort after the war, and were really secretly pleased to see that the sergeant had taken him up. But what for? They asked themselves. Why had the police searched the ewes? Mr. Bailey was a quiet, inoffensive man, very free with his money to everybody around. Jack Beard, cried Deacon to a man in the crowd. Just go down to Ashildham and telephone to Superintendent Warden at Malden. Ask him to send me over 3 men at once. Will you? All right, Sam, was the prompt reply, and the man went off, while the sergeant took the resentful Italian into the house to await an escort. Deacon called the assistance of 2 men and invited them in. Then, while they mounted guard over the prisoner, Featherston addressed the little knot of amazed men who had been alarmed by the Italian's statement. Listen, gentlemen, he said. We shall in a couple of hours' time expect the return of Mr. Bailey, the tenant of this house. There is a very serious charge against him. I therefore put every one of you upon your honor to say no word of what has occurred here tonight, not until Mr. Bailey arrives. I should prefer you all to remain here and wait. Otherwise, if a word be dropped at Southminster, he may turn back and fly from justice. What's the charge, sir? Asked one man, a bearded old laborer. A very serious one, was Walter's evasive reply. Then, after a pause, they all agreed to wait and witness the dramatic arrest of the man who was charged with some mysterious offense. Speculation was rife as to what it would be, and almost every crime in the calendar was cited as likely. Meanwhile, Featherston, returning to the bailiff-furnished sitting room, interrogated Pietro in Italian, but only obtained sullen answers. A loaded revolver had been found upon him by Deacon, and promptly confiscated. I have already searched the place, Walter said to the prisoner, and I know what it contains. But in response, the man who had posed as servant, but who, with his master, was the custodian of the place, only grinned and gave vent to muttered imprecations in Italian. Featherston afterwards left the small assembly and made examination of some bedrooms he had not yet inspected. In 3 of these, the locks of which he broke open, he discovered quantities of interesting papers, together with another mysterious-looking press. While trying to decide what it all meant, he suddenly heard a great shouting and commotion outside, and ran down to the door to ascertain its cause. As he opened it, he saw that in the darkness the crowd outside had grown excited. "Here you are, sir," cried one man, ascending the steps. "Here are 2 visitors. We found 'em coming up the road, and, seeing us, they tried to get away." Walter held up a hurricane lantern which he had found and lit, when its dim, uncertain light fell upon the 2 prisoners in the crowd. Behind stood Summers, while before him, to Featherston's utter amazement, showed Enid Orlebar, pale and terrified, and the grey, sinister face of Dr. Weirmarsh. Chapter 29 contains some startling statements. Enid, recognizing Walter, shrank back instantly in fear and shame, while Weirmarsh started at that unexpected meeting with the man whom he knew to be his bitterest and most formidable opponent. The small crowd of excited onlookers, ignorant of the true facts, but their curiosity aroused by the unusual circumstances, had prevented the pair from turning back and making a hurried escape. "Enid," exclaimed Featherston, as the girl reluctantly crossed the threshold with downcast head. "What is the meaning of this? Why are you paying a visit to this house at such an hour?" "Ah, Walter," she cried, her small, gloved hands clenched with a sudden outburst of emotion. "Be patient and hear me. I will tell you everything, everything." "You won't," growled the doctor sharply. "If you do, by gad, it will be the worse for you. So you'd best keep a silent tongue, otherwise you know the consequences. I shall now tell the truth, and you won't like that." She drew back in terror of the man who held such an extraordinary influence over her. She had grasped Featherston's hand convulsively, but at Weirmarsh's threat she had released her hold and was standing in the hall, pale, rigid and staring. "Summers," exclaimed Featherston, turning to his companion. "You know this person, eh?" "Yes, sir. I should rather think I do," replied the man, with a grin. "Well, detain him for the present, and take your instructions from London." "You have no power or right to detain me," declared the grey-faced doctor in quick defiance. "You are not a police officer." "No, but this is a police officer," Featherston replied, indicating Summers, and adding, "Sergeant, I give that man into custody." The sergeant advanced and laid his big hand upon the doctor's shoulder, telling him to consider himself under arrest. "But this is abominable, outrageous," Weirmarsh cried, shaking him off. "I've committed no offense. That is a matter for later consideration," calmly replied the man who had devoted so much of his time and money to the investigation of mysteries of crime. In one of the bare bedrooms upstairs Featherston had, in examining one of the well-made hand presses set up there, found beside it a number of £1 treasury notes. In curiosity he took one up, and found it to be in an unfinished state. It was printed in green, without the brown coloring. Yet it was perfect as regards the paper and printing, even to its black serial number. Next second the truth flashed upon him. The whole apparatus, presses and everything, had been set up there to print the war paper currency of Great Britain. In the room adjoining he had seen bundles of slips of similar paper, all neatly packed in elastic bands, and waiting the final process of coloring and toning. One bundle had only the Houses of Parliament printed, the other side was blank. He saw in a flash that the placing in circulation of such a huge quantity of treasury notes, amounting to hundreds of thousands of pounds, must seriously damage the credit of the nation. For a few seconds he held an unfinished note in his hand examining it, and deciding that the imitation was most perfect. It deceived him and would undoubtedly deceive any bank teller. In those rooms it was plain that various processes had been conducted, from the manipulation of the watermark, by a remarkably ingenious process, right down to the finished £1 note, so well done that not even an expert could detect the forgery. There were many French 100-franc notes as well. The whole situation was truly astounding. Again the thought hammered home. Such a quantity of paper in circulation must affect the national finances of Britain. And at the head of the band who were printing and circulating those spurious notes was the mysterious medical man who carried on his practice in Pimlico. The scene within the sparsely furnished house containing those telltale presses was indeed a weird one. Somebody had found a cheap paraffin lamp and lit it in the sitting room, where they were all assembled, the front door having been closed. It was apparent that Pietro was no stranger to the doctor and his fair companion, but both men were highly resentful that they had been so entrapped. "Dr. Wearmarsh," exclaimed Featherston seriously, as he stood before him, "I have just examined this house and have ascertained what it contains." "You've told him," cried the man, turning fiercely upon Enid. "You have betrayed me. Ah! It will be the worse for you, and for your family," he added harshly. "You will see. I shall now reveal the truth concerning your stepfather, and you and your family will be held up to opprobrium throughout the whole length and breadth of your land." Enid did not reply. She was pale as death, her face downcast, her lips white as marble. She knew, alas, that Wearmarsh, now that he was cornered, would not spare her. There was a pause, a very painful pause. Everyone next instant listened to a noise which sounded outside. As it grew nearer it grew more distinct, the whir of an approaching motor car. It pulled up suddenly before the door, and a moment later the old bell clanged loudly through the half-empty house. Featherston left the room, and going to the door, threw it open, when yet another surprise awaited him. Upon the steps stood 4 men in thick overcoats, all of whom Walter instantly recognized. With Trendall stood Sir Hugh Elcombe, while their companions were 2 detective inspectors from Scotland Yard. "Hello, Featherston," gasped Trendall. I expected to find Wearmarsh here. What has happened?" "The doctor is already here," was the other's quick reply. "I have found some curious things in this place. Secret printing presses for forged notes." "We already know that," he said. "Sir Hugh Elcombe here has, unknown to us, obtained certain knowledge, and today he came to me and gave me a full statement of what has been in progress. What he has told me this afternoon is among the most valuable and reliable information that we ever received. I know something of the scoundrels," remarked the old general, because, as I have confessed to Mr. Trendall, I yielded to temptation long ago and assisted them. Whatever you have done, Sir Hugh, you have at least revealed to us the whole plot. Only by pretending to render assistance to these scoundrels could you have gained the intensely valuable knowledge which you've imparted to me today," replied the keen-faced director from Scotland Yard. Featherston realized instantly that the fine old fellow, whom he had always held in such esteem, was making every effort to atone for his conduct in the past. But surely that was not the moment to refer to it. So he ushered the 4 men into the ill-lit dining room wherein the others were standing, none knowing how next to act. When the doctor and Sir Hugh faced each other there was a painful silence for a few seconds. To Wearmarsh Trendall was known by sight. Therefore the criminal saw that the game was up, and that Sir Hugh had risked his own reputation in betraying him. "You infernal scoundrel!" cried the doctor angrily. "You, to whom I have paid so many thousands of pounds, have given me away. But I'll be even with you. Say what you like, laughed the old general in defiance. To me it is the same whatever you allege. I have already admitted my slip from the straight path. I do not deny receiving money from your hands, nor do I deny that, in a certain measure, I have committed serious offenses, because, having taken one step, you force me on to others, always holding over me the threat of exposure and ruin. But, fortunately, one day, in desperation, I took Enid yonder into my confidence. It was she who suggested that I might serve the ends of justice, and perhaps atone for what I had already done, by learning your secrets, and, when the time was ripe, revealing all the interesting details to our authorities. Enid became your friend and the friend of your friends. She risked everything, her honor, her happiness, her future, by associating with you for the one and sole purpose of assisting me to learn all the dastardly plot in progress. It was you who supplied Paul Le Pontois with the false notes he passed in France, declared Weirmarsh. The French police know that. And if ever you or your stepdaughter put foot in France, you will be arrested. Evidently you are unaware, Doctor, that my son-in-law, Paul Le Pontois, was released yesterday, la Sir Hugh in triumph. Your treachery, which is now known by the Shoot, defeated its own ends. Further, remarked Walter Featherstone, turning to Enid, it was this man here, and he indicated the grey-faced Doctor of Pimlico, this man who denounced you and Sir Hugh to the French authorities, and had you not heeded my warning you both would then have been arrested. He had evidently suspected the object of your friendliness with me, that you both intended to reveal the truth, and he adopted that course in order to secure your incarceration in a foreign prison, and so close your lips. I knew you suspected me all along, Walter, replied the girl, standing a little aside and suddenly clutching his hand. But you will forgive me now. Forgive me, won't you? She implored, looking up into his dark, determined face. Of course, he replied, I have already forgiven you. I had no idea of the true reason of your association with this man. And he raised her gloved hand and carried it gallantly to his eager lips. Though more than mere suspicion has rested upon you, he went on, you and your stepfather deserve the heartiest thanks of the nation for risking everything in order to be in a position to reveal this dastardly financial plot. That man there, and he indicated the doctor, deserves all he'll get. The doctor advanced threateningly, and, drawing a big automatic revolver from his pocket, would have fired at the man who had spoken his mind so freely had not Deacon, quick as lightning, sprung forward and wrenched the weapon so that the bullet went upward. White with anger and chagrin, the doctor stood roundly abusing the man who had investigated that lonely house. But Featherstone laughed, which only irritated him the more. He raved like a caged lion, until the veins in his brow stood out in great knots. But, finding all protests and allegations useless, he at last became quiet again, and apparently began to review the situation from a purely philosophical standpoint. Until, some 10 minutes later, another motorcar dashed up and in it were an inspector and 4 plainclothes constables, who had been sent over from Malden in response to Deacon's message for assistance. When they entered, Pietro became voluble, but the narrow-eyed Doctor of Pimlico remained sullen and silent, biting his lips. He saw that he had been entrapped by the very man whom he had believed to be as clay in his hands. The scene was surely exciting as well as impressive. The half-furnished, ill-lit dining room was full of excited men, all talking at once. Unnoticed, Walter drew Enid into the shadow, and in a few brief, passionate words reassured her of his great affection. Ah, she cried, bursting into hot tears. Your words, Walter, have lifted a great load of sorrow and apprehension from my mind, for I feared that when you knew the truth you would never, never forgive. But I have forgiven, he whispered, pressing her hand. Then wait until we are alone, and I will tell you everything. Ah, you do not know, Walter, what I have suffered, what a terrible strain I have sustained in these days of terror. But scarcely had she uttered those words when the door reopened and a man was ushered in by Deacon, who had gone out in response to the violent ringing of the bell. This is Mr. Bailey, tenant of the house, gentlemen, said the sergeant, introducing him with mock politeness. Featherstone glanced up, and to his surprise saw standing in the doorway a man he had known, and whose movements he had so closely followed. The man who had gone to Monte Carlo for instructions, and perhaps payment. The man who had passed as Monsieur Granier. Chapter 30. Reveals a woman's love. Great was the consternation caused in the neighborhood of the sleepy old-world village of Asheldham when it became known that the quiet, mild-mannered tenant of the Yews had been arrested by the Malden police. Of what transpired within those grim walls only the two men called to his assistance by Sergeant Deacon knew, and to them both the inspector from Malden, as well as Trendall, expressed a fervent hope that they would regard the matter as strictly confidential. "You see, gentlemen," added Trendall, "we are not desirous that the public should know of our discovery. We wish to avoid creating undue alarm, and at the same time to conceal the very existence of our system of surveillance upon those suspected. Therefore, I trust that all of you present will assist my department by preserving silence as to what has occurred here this evening." His hearers agreed willingly, and through the next hour the place was thoroughly searched, the bundles of spurious notes, the finished ones representing nearly £100,000 ready to put into circulation, being seized. One of the machines they found was for printing in the serial numbers in black, a process which, with genuine notes, is done by hand. Truly, the gang had brought the art of forgery to perfection. "Well," said Trendall when they had finished, "this work of yours, Sir Hugh, certainly deserves the highest commendation. You have accomplished what we, with all our great organization, utterly failed to do." "I have today tried to atone for my past offenses," was the stern old man's hoarse reply. "And you have succeeded, Sir Hugh," declared Trendall. "Indeed you have." Shortly afterwards the excitement among the crowd waiting outside in the light of the headlamps of the motorcars was increased by the appearance of the doctor, escorted by two Malden police officers in plain clothes. They mounted a police car and were driven away down the road, while into a second car the tenant of the Yews and his Italian manservant were placed under escort, and also driven away. The station fly, in which Bailey had driven from Southminster, conveyed away Featherstone, Trendall, Sir Hugh, and Enid, while Deacon, with two men, was left in charge of the House of Secrets. It was past 1 o'clock in the morning when Walter Featherstone stood alone with Enid in the pretty drawing-room in Hill Street. They stood together upon the View's rose hearthrug. His hand was upon her shoulder, his deep, earnest gaze fixed upon hers. In her splendid eyes the love light showed. They had both admired each other intensely from their first meeting, and had become very good and staunch friends. Walter Featherstone had only once spoken of the passion that had constantly consumed his heart, when they were by the blue sea at Biarritz. He loved her with the whole strength of his being, and yet, try how he would, he could never put aside the dark cloud of suspicion which, as the days went by, became more and more impenetrable. Sweet-faced, frank, and open, she stood, the ideal of the English outdoor girl, merry, quick-witted, and athletic. And yet, after the stress of war, she had sacrificed all that she held most dear in order to become the friend of Wearmarsh. "Why, Enid," he said at last, his tender hand still upon her shoulder, "why did you not tell me your true position? You were working in the same direction, with the same strong motive of patriotism, as myself." She was silent, very pale, and very serious. "I feared to tell you, Walter," she faltered. "How could I possibly reveal to you the truth when I knew you were aware how my stepfather had unconsciously betrayed his friends? You judged us both as undesirables. Therefore any attempt at explanation would, I know, only aggravate our offense in your eyes. You do not know how intensely I have suffered, how bitter it all was. I knew the reason you followed us to France, to watch and confirm your suspicions. I admit, Enid, that I suspected you of being in the hands of a set of scoundrels," her lover said in a low, hoarse voice. "At first I hesitated whether to warn you of your peril after Wearmarsh had, with such dastardly cunning, betrayed you to the French police. But, well," he added as he looked again into her dear eyes long and earnestly, "I loved you, Enid," he blurted forth. "I told you so. Remember, dear, what you said at Biarritz. And I love you, and because of that I resolved to save you." "Which you did," she said in a strained, mechanical tone. "We both have you to thank for our escape. Wearmarsh, having first implicated Paul, then made allegations against us, in order to send us to prison, because he feared lest my stepfather might, in a fit of remorse, act indiscreetly and make a confession. The past will all be forgiven now that Sir Hugh has been able to expose and unmask Wearmarsh and his band," Walter assured her. "A great sensation may possibly result, but it will, in any case, show that even though an Englishman may be bought, he can still remain honest. And, he added, it will also show them that there is at least one brave woman in England who sacrificed her love. For I know well, Enid, that you fully reciprocate the great affection I feel towards you, in order to bear her noble part in combating a wily and unscrupulous gang. It was surely my duty, replied the girl simply, her eyes downcast in modesty. Yet association with that dastardly blackguard, Dr. Wehrmarsh, was horrible. How I refrained from turning upon him through all those months I cannot really tell. I detested him from the first moment Sir Hugh invited him to our table. And though I went to assist him under guise of consultations, I acted with one object all along, she declared, her eyes raised to his and flashing, to expose him in his true guise, that of Joseph Blott, the head of the most dangerous association of forgers, of international thieves and blackmailers known to the police for the past half a century. Which you have surely done. You have revealed the whole plot, and confounded those who were so cleverly conspiring to effect a sudden and most gigantic coup. But, and he paused, still looking into her eyes through his pince-nez, and sighed. But what? She asked, in some surprise at his sudden change of manner. There is one matter, Enid, which, and he paused, well, which is still a mystery to me, and I want you to explain it, he said in slow deliberation. What is that? She asked, looking at him quickly. The mystery which you have always refused to assist me in unraveling. The mystery of the death of Harry Bellairs, was his quiet reply. You held him in high esteem. You loved him, he added in a voice scarce above a whisper. She drew back. Her countenance suddenly blanched as she put her hand quickly to her brow and reeled slightly as though she had been dealt a blow. Walter watched her in blank wonderment. Chapter 31, in which Sir Hugh tells his story. You know the truth, don't you, dearest? Walter asked at last in that quiet, sympathetic tone which he always adopted towards her whom he loved so well. Enid nodded in the affirmative, her face hard and drawn. He was killed, was he not? Deliberately murdered. For a few seconds the silence was unbroken save for a whir of a taxicab passing outside. Yes, was her somewhat reluctant response. You went to his rooms that afternoon, Walter asserted point-blank. I do not deny that. I followed him home. To save him. There was a break in her voice as she stammered out the last words, and tears rushed into her dark eyes. From what? From death. No, from falling a prey to a great temptation set before him. By whom? By the doctor, to whom my stepfather had introduced him, was the girl's reply. I discovered by mere chance that the doctor, who had somewhat got him into his clutches, had approached him in order to induce him to allow him to take a wax impression of a certain safe key belonging to a friend of his named Thurston, a diamond broker in Hatton Garden. He had offered him a very substantial sum to do this, a sum which would have enabled him to clear off all his debts and start afresh. Harry's younger brother Bob had got into a mess, and in helping him out Harry had sadly entangled himself and was practically face to face with bankruptcy. I knew this, and I knew what a great temptation had been placed before him. Fearing lest, in a moment of despair, he might accept, I went, by appointment, to his chambers as soon as I arrived in London. Barker, his man, had been sent out, and we were alone. I found him in desperation. Yet to my great delight he had defied Wehrmarsh, saying he refused to betray his friend. And what did Bellairs tell you further? He expressed suspicion that my stepfather was in the doctor's pay, she replied. I tried to convince him to the contrary, but Wehrmarsh's suggestion had evidently furnished the key to some suspicious document which he had one day found on Sir Hugh's writing table. Well, she went on slowly, we quarreled. I was indignant that he should suspect my stepfather, and he was full of vengeance against Sir Hugh's friend the doctor. Presently I left, and I never saw him again alive. What happened? What happened is explained by this letter, she replied, crossing to a little buhl bureau which she unlocked, taking out a sealed envelope. On breaking it open and handing it to him, she said, This is the letter he wrote to me with his dying hand. I have kept it a secret even from Sir Hugh. Walter read the uneven lines eagerly. They grew more shaky and more illegible towards the end, but they were sufficient to make the truth absolutely clear. Tonight, half an hour ago, wrote the dying man, I had a visit from your friend, Wehrmarsh. We were alone, with none to overhear, so I told him plainly that I intended to expose him. At first he became defiant, but presently he grew apprehensive, and on taking his leave he made a foul accusation against you. Then, laughing at my refusal to accept his bribe, the scoundrel took my hand in farewell. He must have had a pin stuck in his glove, for I felt a slight scratch across the palm. At the moment I was too furious to pay any attention to it, but 10 minutes after he had gone I began to experience a strange faintness. I feel now fainter and fainter. A strange feeling has crept over me. I am dying, poisoned, by that king of thieves. Come to me quickly, at once, Enid, and tell me that what he has said against you is not true. It cannot be true. Don't delay. Come quickly. Can't write more. Harry. Walter paused for a second after reading through that dramatic letter, the last effort of a dying man. And that scoundrel Wearmarsh killed him because he feared exposure, he remarked in a low, hard voice. Why did you not bring this forward at the inquest? For several reasons, replied the girl. I feared the doctor's reprisals. Besides, he might easily have denied the allegation, or he might have used the same means to close my lips if he had suspected that I had learnt the truth. The dead man's story is no doubt true, declared Featherstone. He used some deadly poison, one of the newly discovered ones which leaves no trace, to kill his victim who, in all probability, was not his first. Your stepfather does not know, of course, that this letter exists. No, I have kept it from everyone. I said that the summons I received from him I had destroyed. In the circumstances I will ask you, Enid, to allow me to retain it, he said. I want to show it to Trendall. You may show it to Mr. Trendall, but I ask you, for the present, to make no further use of it, replied the girl. He moved a step closer to her and caught her disengaged hand in his, the glad light in her eyes telling him that his action was one which she reciprocated, yet some sense of her unworthiness of this great love causing her to hesitate. I will promise, said the strong, manly fellow in a low tone. I ought to have made allowances, but, in the horror of my suspicion, I did not, and I'm sorry. I love you, Enid. I had never really loved until I met you, until I held your hand in mine. Enid's true, overburdened heart was only too ready to respond to his fervent appeal. She suffered her lover to draw her to himself, and their lips met in a long, passionate caress that blotted out all the past. He spoke quick, rapid words of ardent affection. To Enid, after all the hideous events she had passed through, it seemed too happy to be true that so much bliss was in store for her, and she remained there, with Walter's arm around her, silently content, that fervid kiss being the first he had ever imprinted upon her full red lips. Thus they remained in each other's arms, their two true hearts beating in unison, their kisses mingling, their twin souls united in the first moments of their newly found ecstasy of perfect love. The fight had been a fierce one, but their true hearts had won, and, as they whispered each other's fond affection, Enid promised to be the wife of the honest, fearless man of whose magnificent work in the detection of crime the country had never dreamed. They read his books and were enthralled by them, but little did they think that he was one of the never-sleeping watchdogs upon great criminals, or that the sweet-faced girl, who was now his affianced wife, had risked her life, her love, her honor, in order to assist him. Next afternoon Sir Hugh called upon Walter at his dingy chambers in Holles Street, and as they sat together the old general, after a long and somewhat painful silence, exclaimed, I know, Featherstone, that you must be mystified how, in my position, I should have become implicated in the doings of that criminal gang. Yes, I am, Walter declared. Well, briefly, it occurred in this way, said the old officer. While I was a colonel in India just before the war, I was very hard-pressed for money and had committed a fault, an indiscretion for which I might easily have been dismissed from the army. On being recalled to London, after war had been declared, I was approached by the fellow Wearmarsh who, to my horror, had, by some unaccountable means, obtained knowledge of my indiscretion. At first he adopted a high moral tone, upbraiding me for my fault and threatening to inform against me. This I begged him not to do. For a fortnight he kept me in an agony of despair, when one day he called me to him and unfolded to me a scheme by which I could make a considerable amount of money. Indeed, he promised to pay me a yearly sum for my assistance. You thought him to be a doctor, and nothing else? Walter said, Exactly. I never dreamed until quite recently that he was head of such a formidable gang, whose operations were upon so extensive a scale as to endanger our national credit," replied Sir Hugh. "At the time he approached me, I was in the pay department, and many thousands of pounds in treasury notes were passing through my safe weekly. His suggestion was that I should exchange the notes as they came to me from the treasury for those with which he would supply me, and which, on showing me a specimen, I failed to distinguish from the real. I hesitated. I was hard up. To sustain my position after my knighthood, money was absolutely necessary to me, and for a long time I had been unable to make both ends meet. The bait he dangled before me was sufficiently tempting, well, I fell," he groaned, and then after a pause he went on. "Whence Wearmarsh obtained the packets of notes which I substituted for genuine ones was, of course, a mystery, but once having taken the false step it was not my business to inquire. Not until quite recently did I discover his real position as chief of a gang of international crooks who combined forgery with blackmail and theft upon a colossal scale. That he intended Bellairs should furnish him with an impression of the safe key of a diamond dealer in Hatton Garden is now plain. Bellairs defied him and threatened to denounce him to the police. Therefore, the poor fellow's lips were quickly closed by the scoundrel, who would hesitate at nothing in order to preserve his guilty secrets." "But what caused you to break from him at last?" inquired Walter eagerly. "Just before the armistice he and his friends had conceived a gigantic scheme by which Europe and the United States were to be flooded with great quantities of spurious paper currency, and though it would, when discovered, as it must have been sooner or later, have injured the national credit, would bring huge fortunes to him and his friends. He was pressing me to send in my papers and go to America, there to act as their agent at a huge remuneration. They wanted a man of standing who should be above suspicion, and he had decided to use me as his tool to engineer the gigantic frauds. And you, happily, refused." "Yes, I resolved, rather than act further, to relinquish the handsome payments he made to me from time to time. For that reason I got transferred from the pay department, so that I could no longer be of much use to him, a fact which annoyed him greatly." "And he threatened you?" "Yes, he was constantly doing so. He wanted me to go to New York. Enid helped me and gave me courage to defy him, which I did. Then he conceived a dastardly revenge by anonymously denouncing Le Pontois as a forger, and implicating both Enid and myself. He contrived that some money I brought from England should be exchanged for spurious notes, and these Paul unsuspiciously gave into the credit Lyonese. Had it not been for your timely warning, Featherstone, we should both have also been arrested in France without a doubt." "Yes," replied the other. "I was watching, and realized your peril, though I confess that my position was one of extreme difficulty. I, of course, did not know the actual truth, and, to be frank, I suspected both Enid and yourself of being implicated in some very serious crime." "So we were," he said in a low, hard voice. "True, but you have both been the means of revealing to the Treasury a state of things of which they never dreamed. And by turning King's evidence and giving the names and addresses of members of the gang in Brussels and Paris, all of whom are now under arrest, you have saved the country from considerable peril. Had the plot succeeded, a very serious state of things must have resulted, for the whole of our paper currency would have been suspected. For that reason the authorities have, I understand, now that they have arrested the gang and seized their presses, decided to hush up the whole matter. You know this?" asked Sir Hugh, suddenly brightening. "Yes, Trenall told me so this morning." "Ah, thank heaven," he gasped, much relieved. "Then I can again face the world a free man. God knows how terribly I suffered through all those years of the war. I paid for my fault very dearly, I assure you, Featherstone." Chapter 32. Conclusion. What remains to be related is quickly told, though the public have, until now, been in ignorance of the truth. Out of evil a great good had come. At noon on the following day Trenall had an interview with Joseph Blott, alias Wearmarsh, in his cell at Chelmsford, whither he had been conveyed by the police. What happened at that interview will never be known. It is safe to surmise, however, that the tragic letter of Harry Bellairs was shown to him, Enid having withdrawn her request that no use should be made of it. An hour after the chief of the Criminal Investigation Department had left, the prisoner was found lying stark dead, suffering from a scratch on the wrist, inflicted with a short, hollow needle which he had carried concealed behind the lapel of his coat. Greatly to the discomfiture of the gang, the man Granier and his servant Pietro were extradited to France for trial, while a quantity of jewelry, works of art, money, and negotiable securities of all sorts were unearthed from a villa near Fontainebleau and restored to their owners. A fortnight after Wearmouth's death, at St. George's, Hanover Square, Enid Orlebar became the wife of Walter Featherstone, and among the guests at the wedding were a number of strange men in whose position or profession nobody pretended to be interested. Truth to tell, they were officials of various grades from Scotland Yard, surely the most welcome among the wedding guests. Though Walter and Enid live in idyllic happiness in a charming old ivy-grown manor house in Sussex, with level lawns and shady rose arbors, they still retain that old cottage at Idsworth, where a plausible excuse has been given to the country folk for Mr. Maltwood having been compelled to change his name. No pair in the whole of England are happier today. No man holds his wife more dear, or has a more loving and hopeful companion. Their life is one of perfect and abiding peace and of sweet content. Walter Featherstone is not by any means idle, for in his quiet country home he still writes those marvelous mystery stories which hold the world breathlessly enthralled. But he continues to devote half his time to combating the ingenuity of the greater criminals with all its attendant excitement and adventure, which are reflected in his popular romances. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel for more timeless classics. Your support helps me create and share more stories with you. Thank you.